Mr. B's, Mr. B's, Mr. B's history. Now then, people, one of the things I like to do at the beginning of my videos, looking at various topics at GCSE History, is to try and hook you in with an idea which may seem a little weird at first, but actually at its root has a very interesting parallel. And it's this. Let's look at Elizabeth I. What on earth do you think that she has in common with the character Satine from Baz Luhrmann's excellent film Moulin Rouge? Stay with me, people. This is important as it will lead us into the next slide. And actually, the topic, drumroll please, is Elizabeth I and her court. I told you it was good. Right, I'm sure you're now absolutely gripped with this absolute cliffhanger. How on earth can Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, be at all like Satine from Moulin Rouge? Well, let's go back a bit. Let's look at in more detail at what this video is about. It's about how Elizabeth managed to run the country so effectively. Think about it. Under Elizabeth, England was an island of Protestantism in a sea of Catholic states. Many men competed for a hand in marriage. Some planned to remove her or even murder, and in the exceptional case of Philip II at different times, both. So, how was it then that Elizabeth not only flourished, but ruled so successfully that her reign by many historians has been described as a golden age? I'm going to suggest to you in this video that one of the reasons why she was able to succeed was her highly effective and personalised government through the power she dispensed by her royal presence over her nobles at court. And further on, we're going to look at how the court is used by both Elizabeth and her nobles for their own interests. And trust me, Satine will be in there somewhere. Before we focus on the Elizabethan court, I want to go back a step and look at an overview of her government in general. Ian Mortermer, in his excellent Time Traveller's Guide to Elizabethan England, identifies five key elements of Elizabethan rule. The Privy Council, which met on a regular basis, was made up of her leading nobles and was effectively a sort of cabinet government, chaired initially by William Cecil. Secondly, there was Elizabeth's power of patronage. This means her ability to give and take away nobles' jobs, titles, lands, powers. One example is she often granted a noble a monopoly. So, for example, she granted Robert Dudley, one of her favourites, a monopoly on sweet wines. It was the taking away of that monopoly with the later Earl of Essex that led indirectly to the Essex Rebellion. The royal purse. This is about how Elizabeth spends money both on herself but also on the court. She funded some of the accommodation and all of the food for all of the up to 1,000 or so people in her court. Parliament. Clearly Parliament was essential. Parliament rose to significance, particularly under the reign of her father Henry VIII, when he used it as a mechanism to achieve his break from Rome. So 4 P's so far: Privy Council, patronage, purse and Parliament, and the thing that we're going to focus on later in this presentation, what Mortimer calls the presence, which is where Elizabeth is, both either in the court or when she's on one of her many royal progresses. So what exactly is the court? Well, what the court is not is a place where the legal system plays out and justice is dispensed under a judge. The court is wherever Elizabeth is present, be that at one of her royal palaces or on one of her many tours of southern England known as a royal progress. It is a daily display by the Queen of power and prestige, made up of regular entertainments such as dances, music, plays, etc. In fact, as an aside, Elizabeth never went to watch a Shakespeare play at the Globe Theatre, but Shakespeare's players did play for Elizabeth at her court. And it is a place where people could get noticed, mainly nobles, but also some younger gentlemen. For example, Sir Walter Raleigh could get noticed by Elizabeth, could gain titles, land, jobs, and achieve political influence. That is the court. So, how does Elizabeth use the court to control powerful men? Well, I think the historian Christopher Hay puts it particularly well. Elizabeth attempts to control her councillors and her magnates. Remember, magnates are very senior, significant landowning nobles, people like the Earl of Northumberland. And she tries to draw them into a web of personal, even emotional relationships with her. She wants to be seen as both queen and coquette. Now, a coquette, as defined by the Cambridge English Dictionary, is a woman who likes to attract attention by behaving as if she is sexually interested in people in a pleasant but not too serious way. So clearly, when she's in her early 20s, unmarried, partially unscarred by smallpox, this is a much more straightforward task for Elizabeth to achieve. Right, in many ways, this is the critical slide of the video. What I wanted to think about is the idea of the court as beneficial to both parties, both to Elizabeth and to her nobles. Elizabeth, as we already heard, has been described as a coquette, someone who uses her youthful attractiveness to control her nobility. And you can see her in that sense as the puppeteer. And these are the sorts of things that Elizabeth gets from it. This is a daily display of power and entertainment. She demonstrates her raw power and authority simply by her presence. But she also, in terms of political advice, is able to widen her talent or advice pool. Rather than just getting information and advice from members of her Privy Council, she could choose to ask any member of the court their views on a particular aspect. Privy councillors were all key courtiers. Usually 50 to 60 courtiers were regular attendants, although it has been calculated that Elizabeth knew up to 2/3 of the nobility of England, as they were occasional attendees of the court. It also enabled Elizabeth to keep a watch on suspect, usually Catholic subjects, such as the Duke of Norfolk or the Earl of Northumberland. And if there's an unexpected absence from court without Elizabeth's permission, that may be an early warning sign of trouble, i.e. rebellion. And finally, the court helps Elizabeth to reinforce support for her policies, because courtiers lose influence or jobs if they do not support the Queen, as jobs often required an oath of loyalty to her. So it was in the nobles' interests to carry out the Queen's policies. And there are a number of things, a number of ways in which the nobles benefited. So for the courtiers, by capturing the Queen's attention, you could get influence, land grants, titles. At various times, her major favourite of the early part of her reign, Robert Dudley, was made Earl of Leicester. He became a Privy Councillor. He was given Kenilworth Castle, and he was given monopoly holder for sweet wine imports, which raked in an awful lot of money for him. Perhaps even later on in the reign, as Elizabeth went beyond her 30s, she seemed to become increasingly attached to young, athletic and literate men who could rise rapidly from relative obscurity. One of the classic examples of this is Sir Walter Raleigh. And a quote from him: "Fain would I climb, but yet fear I to fall," i.e., if I lose the support and interest of Elizabeth, I'll lose everything I've got. And again, there is a danger in the court, because if there's a perceived exclusion from the court, it could spark rebellion. Chris Hay identifies one of the causes of the Northern Rebellion of 1569 by the Earl of Northumberland as being excluded from court. So there you are. In summary, there are benefits for Elizabeth being at court, but there are also benefits for her courtiers, although for her courtiers it also comes with a bit of a government health warning. Okay, one way I'll try and get over slightly more different concepts, such as the court to people, is to try and give them a different way of thinking about it. So have a look at this picture. Those of you who are already shouting at the screen that that's not Elizabeth I, I do know that. This is the singer Satine entering the Moulin Rouge nightclub from Baz Luhrmann's brilliant film called Moulin Rouge. I would love to show you the clip of her being lowered down on a trapeze to an adoring male audience. But obviously I can't really do that, but I have put a link to the video in the description below, and I urge you to watch it. It gives this real sense of what Hay talks about as the Queen as coquette, as this young woman who uses her sexual allure to have power and dominion over her nobles. So watch the video from the description below. Hope you enjoy it, because I think it's great. So if you Google Elizabethan Court and search for images, this image comes up very often. It is held at Penhurst Place, and it's supposedly a painting showing Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley having a dance, a very daring dance, a dance called the Volta. What you may notice here is exactly where Robert Dudley's hand is. Now it looks like it's being very rude, but actually he's holding a firm part of the Elizabethan corset, probably made of whalebone, very carefully with a handkerchief in his hand if you really stare, so as not to stain the dress. And Robert only appears to have one leg. That's because the other leg is behind Elizabeth, helping her leap into the air in a daring dance called the Volta. But again, this is a really interesting picture about the court. You have the musicians, you have the entertainment, you have various nobles. Those of you who know a little bit more about Elizabeth's love life, this may be a painting of her frog, who she actually agreed to marry for one day. So a really interesting portrait of the Elizabethan court in action, and Elizabeth doing her thing. Nice. I accept that many of you watching this video may think that my comparison of the glorious Virgin Queen Elizabeth I with a fictional nightclub singer Satine from Moulin Rouge is a little far-fetched. However, may I humbly put forward this piece of evidence to suggest that there is at least a grain of truth. And after all, the art of understanding and getting people to think about things is by challenging them to think. So, even into her 60s, Elizabeth is trying to use her feminine charms to control, influence, enrapture men. So in 1597, the newly appointed French ambassador to the English court describes a meeting with Elizabeth. He describes many aspects of the conversation and her physical appearance, such as her long fingers, but he then goes on to describe her as having significant amounts of décolletage on display. Now, in some places, you will see this translated as bare-breasted, i.e. that Elizabeth was sitting there and the French ambassador could see all of her breasts. Now, John Guy, in his fabulous book Elizabeth the Forgotten Years, mainly about 1590s, says that this is a misunderstanding and a mistranslation of the word décolletage, and essentially what he's saying is that Elizabeth isn't bare-breasted, but she is simply displaying fairly ample 64-year-old cleavage. So I suggest that this is an example of Elizabeth really in her twilight years still trying to influence, control, enrapture powerful men. Satine would be proud. So how does Elizabeth's personal rule change as she gets older? We've seen at the start that Elizabeth is at the heart of this personal relationship with her courtiers. And when she's younger, when she's still potentially a viable marriage prospect, that certainly seems to work well for her. Certainly for the first decade of her reign, there are no wide-scale plots or rebellions. However, perhaps it is more difficult for Elizabeth when she gets into the 1590s, when she's much older, and that her courtiers, her loyal courtiers from the 1560s and 70s, Robert Dudley, William Cecil die, and they are replaced by much younger men than Elizabeth. This means that to an extent she is less able to enrapture her courtiers, to captivate them. The Earl of Essex famously describes her as being as crooked as her carcass. And perhaps this is one reason why the decade of the 1590s, the twilight years of Elizabeth I, are seen as being far less successful than they were perhaps with the high watermark of the defeat of the Armada in 1588. So one of the things I try and do in these videos is just give you a direction, a link towards more depth and more detail. If you really want to know something about the Elizabethan Court, but in a lot more detail about royal progress, I can't recommend highly enough the BBC Teach video with Ian Mortermer, What Was Life Like in the Court of Elizabeth. Particularly brilliant on the costs and potential benefits of a visit by Elizabeth and one of her progresses. So links in description below. Hope you enjoy it. Watch it. It will be of benefit. Well, people, you have been witness to a world's first. This is my first effort at making a YouTube video to help students with their history. As members of my family may be able to tell you, this is about the 53rd take. So hopefully bits of it are useful. Hopefully you would like to see more. If you have any comments or questions, please drop me a comment below this video, or you can email me at mrbshistory1832@gmail.com. Thank you for taking time to watch this offering. It's been quite a long video, so do it in small chunks, please. Thank you and good night.